Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Welcome to Morning Shot. The late former President Jimmy Carter is lying in state at the US Capitol Rotunda ahead of a funeral service set to be held at the Washington National Cathedral, where President Joe Biden will deliver a eulogy.
Carter, a Democrat, served one White House term from 1977 to 1981 and was the oldest living former U.S. president and the first to reach 100 years old. He led enduring foreign policy initiatives, including a peace deal between Israel and Egypt, the normalization of relations with China, and the treaties that gave Panama control of the Panama Canal from the U.S.
For more insights into the legacy of the 39th President of the United States, we're joined by two guests. Let me first introduce Amber Roessner, professor from the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee. She has previously interviewed Jimmy Carter and written a book about him as well. Thank you for joining the show, Professor Roessner.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And also joining us is Charles S Bullock III, Richard B. Russell Chair in Political Science, and Josiah Meigs, Distinguished Teaching Professor and University Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. Thank you, Professor Bullock, for your time and insights.
It's so good to be with you.
Glad to have you both on. Professor Roessner, we'll kick things off with you. Now, you interviewed the man in the flesh back in 2014, which must have been a highlight for you, for a book about a 10-year period of his life. And you focused on his relationship with the media and how it may have altered his perception. What left the deepest impression for you during that encounter and everything that he shared with you?
Well, certainly from a personal standpoint, I was struck by his personal kindness. He told me that he had read my first book, which is about early sports journalism, and he made it a point to put me at ease. And I think that's particularly significant because I think it's really reflective of the kinds of personal encounters that he had with others, particularly after his presidency. Beyond that, I was struck by his lingering frustration about the regional bias that he had encountered from Washington-based journalists during his campaign and presidency. 4 decades after the fact, he still referenced an editorial cartoon that had appeared in the Washington Star on Inauguration Day that had featured an outhouse on the White House lawn and even his mother with a hayseed out of her mouth.
Wow. Okay, so that really stood out to you. Was there anything else about former President Carter that really spoke about the president that he was?
Well, certainly, as I noted, he spent a lot of time talking to me about his relationship with news reporters of the era. It's interesting because at this particular moment in time, he's really notable in terms of public memory for his post-presidential legacy. But certainly he was quite proud of the legacy that he left in the White House that, of course, had been greatly overshadowed by the kind of challenging moment that he encountered that last year of his presidency.
All right, Professor Bullock, let's bring you into the conversation now. Americans are reflecting on President Carter's life and leadership. How would you describe or characterize his presidency in today's context? And what would you say is his most enduring legacy that he's left behind?
Well, like today's presidents, he had problems with Congress, although his came from a very different kind of situation. It wasn't because he didn't have large margins. Indeed, Democrats had the same kind of large margins they had under Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt. But Carter didn't get along well with Congress. He was perceived to be, and I think to some extent wanted to present himself as being the outsider, the newcomer to town. And while that worked for him as a candidate, it was not particularly useful to him as a president who has to work with a bunch of insiders. And so he missed some of the cues that he needed to pick up on in order to succeed. So when we talk about his presidency, there's not a whole lot that we point to from his domestic policy. Indeed, most of the concentration is on foreign policy, and there specifically with the Camp David Accords, which then brought peace between Israel and Egypt.
Yeah, Professor Bullock, I also want to touch on race and inequality, which continue to be themes that I suppose dominate or divide American politics to this day. How would you describe former President Carter's approach to these two themes, especially considering his Southern roots, as well as his efforts to address systemic discrimination during his presidency?
Right, yeah. Well, his relationship with regard to race is complex. I mean, he grew up in a predominantly black area, so he knew and understood and interacted with black people, although not as probably as equals back when he was growing up. He was sensitive to discrimination against blacks locally, and when he was on the local school board, he worked to improve the conditions of their schools. But then when he ran for governor, he ran as the racist candidate. He ran with the appeal to white supremacy, but then he amazes everyone, and this is what got him on the front page of the New York Times, on the cover of Time magazine, was in his inaugural address. He said, all this stuff about race, about discrimination, we've got to put that behind us. And from that point on, he did. He began appointing black judges here in Georgia, and then he also continued doing that when he became President of the United States. He, of course, also appointed the first black woman to serve in the president's cabinet with Patricia Harris. So, well, he puts that campaign, which he had to run probably in order to get elected, behind him, and that's not something he writes about. He writes about everything else in his career, but not that. And so, yes, he is very much remembered as having worked well with African Americans. And when his campaign in 1976 was in danger of losing, it was the black leadership in Atlanta, led by the King family, and which, since he bailed him out, and they testified on his behalf that, yes, he really is responsive to black concerns, civil rights concerns, and that then united the black vote behind him, which was very necessary for him to be elected.
Well, Professor Bullock really did expand on this pretty well. But Professor Roessner, what's your take? We know President Carter is from Georgia, lived in Georgia. How do you think his time and his experiences in his home state, influence his policies? And how did his political career kind of bridge both rural and urban Georgia?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think certainly as Professor Bullock has indicated, his time growing up in rural Georgia certainly shaped and impacted his views and understandings of race. He speaks very eloquently about this moment in time in which several of his black friends had started to let him move into a gate out of deference. And he said that, which was kind of a part of the racial order of the moment. And he said that initially he thought, were they going to trip him? But then he saw, that was, they were engaged in that as a part of that moment in time in the racial order, as I noted. And, certainly I think that, as Professor Bullock suggested, he did engage in race baiting in his run for governor. He certainly never had marched for integration in the 60s. But as we noted, he said at his inauguration as governor that the time for racial discrimination was over. And he famously and symbolically hung a portrait of slain civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. in the state capitol thereafter. And then I think that with support from Martin Luther King Sr. and folks like Andrew Young, he made it his mission to translate his campaign message of love into simple justice, both during his presidency and his post-presidency. And you see where he starts to champion human rights around the globe.
Yeah, Professor Bullock, bringing you back into the conversation, Jimmy Carter was known to be able to relate pretty well to diverse populations across the social spectrum. Do you think this was crucial to his ability to enact meaningful social change?
Well, yeah. I mean, he had to be able to do that. But as I said at the beginning, he was not terribly successful in getting things through Congress, although he had this huge Democratic majority. So what he's remembered for now, and what most of the discussion here is about, has been his post-presidential leadership. And during that, yes, he was a man of the world, traveling the world and interacting not just with a variety of Americans, but with people of all races, religions, creeds, and economic statuses, as he worked to advance the efforts of the Carter legacy and doing things such as, battling guinea worm and water blindness and things of that nature, and then trying to promote democracy across the globe. So, yeah, he does have an ability to interact with people in all stages of life.
All right. Yeah. Another one of President Carter's hallmarks was his focus on human rights and diplomacy when it came to foreign policy. So, Professor Roessner, this one's to you. How was his approach different from previous administrations, and what impact did it have on America's kind of global reputation?
Yeah, certainly. His policies certainly marked a break from the Nixon and Ford administration. As he famously noted in 1977, for too many years we've been willing to adopt the flawed and erroneous principles and tactics of our adversaries, sometimes abandoning our own values for theirs. Then he goes on to note that through failure, we've now found our way back to our principles and values. We've regained our lost confidence. And I think that certainly Carter's focus on championing human rights, promoting free and fair elections, battling disease, and fighting to keep the peace goes a long way of restoring confidence in the U.S. globally, both during and after his presidency.
Professor Bullock, coming back to you, how would you say Jimmy Carter's words and actions, or more broadly his legacy, influenced future administrations, subsequent presidents?
Well, I think really before Jimmy Carter becomes president, no chief executive in this country was terribly concerned about human rights outside of the country, and many of them were not particularly concerned about human rights within the country. So that may be his major effort that continues on, is that making that a major element of American foreign policy. I'm not sure any of the presidents in his wake have given it the same level precedence within their concerns, but at least it now is something that most of all of the successes of chief executives have at least considered and talked about to some extent. While before that, it was not really an issue.
So what do you make of President-elect Donald Trump's promise to use his second term to undo some of Carter's signature accomplishments?
Well, I think the most significant one probably is talking about wanting to take back the Panama Canal. And that was one of the things which Carter got through the Senate, which was very, very difficult. It narrowly passes. And Trump to say we're going to go and plant the American flag and take that back is really kind of unimaginable. But that would be, I guess that's the thing that really sticks out in my mind, is something that Trump says he wants to undo. I guess on a lesser level, we could say Carter was the first president to express some concern about global warming. That is not something that his successors on the Republican side have taken much interest in, and certainly not likely that Donald Trump is going to do anything to promote efforts to control global warming.
All right. Yeah, it was clear that President Carter was deeply committed to addressing issues of inequality, both during his presidency and in his post-presidential humanitarian work. Finally, Professor Roessner, I'm going to give you the last word here. In what ways do Carter's ideals continue to shape U.S. politics, both foreign and domestic today?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that in championing peace and human rights, Carter really does offer a productive model for international relations in the aftermath of Vietnam. And moreover, in terms of U.S. domestic and foreign policy, I think he was really prescient in terms of the ways in which he pled for the importance of energy and environmental conservation. And, I think he will be remembered as a man of integrity who was president at a transformative moment in American history, and who offers a exemplary model for public servants and also for everyday citizens in the ways in which they should give back to their communities.
All right. Well, a great breakdown to reflect on the legacy of former President Jimmy Carter, a leader who emphasized diplomacy, equality, and civil rights. His state funeral service will be held on Thursday in Washington, D.C., which has been declared a national day of mourning. Thank you both, Professor Roessner and Professor Bullock, for your time and insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You were hearing from Amber Roessner, professor from the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at University of Tennessee, and Charles S Bullock III, Richard B. Russell Chair in Political Science, and Josiah Meigs, Distinguished Teaching Professor and University Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. Stay with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.